Run it back, Spence. Run it back. What's up, my dudes? A track review? Spencer Turley track review? MX Simulator? What the hell is this? I don't even know, dog. Haven't done one of these in about 35 decades. So we got Red Plate SX made by Honda 708. So, yeah, this is a great track. Kind of confused on why this couldn't be like how the 2020 RF Supercross tracks were. Still a little confused by that, but this is a perfect example of how you make a, right in that awesome balance in between 1-to-1 scaling and like fantasy too big scaling. It's perfectly in between those two things, which I consider to be like the perfect way to make an MX Simulator track, quote unquote, for pro racing, right? You don't want to make it too 1-to-1 scale like Anaheim 1 RF 2020 track, because then there's no big lines, everything's too small, all the berms are too small, you guys blah, 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 you know how that is, right? The tracks just suck. They end up sucking when they get them too 1-to-1 scale. This game is not really made for 1-to-1 scale tracks. It's really not. It's never really worked. They continue to, every other round try to kind of go down that road, but it still never really works. So, but you also don't want to go super, super fantasy where you have way too big of jumps, right? So there is a balancing act there to it. And this is that perfect in between, in my opinion. This is that perfect where it's like the jumps are still big enough to give you that skill gap, and you still have to really be able to angle the bike down, and if you come up short on something, there's enough of a penalty to it. You can actually pop off. The quads are hard enough, but not way too insane. There's like a whole balance to that. The only thing I would say about this track that I wasn't a super big fan of is it is still kind of going down those weird roads of that new sort of whoop vibe design that they've been doing in this modern day RF track making, where it doesn't even really feel like whoops. It just feels like really, really rolled off, tamed down, mellowed out whoops, like a local vibe supercross track whoops versus actual legit hardcore real AMA supercross whoops. This track definitely has that issue where it's just, you're just kind of wide open on them, man. They're not really, you don't really have to like stay on top of the whoops, or really like, there is no sort of stress that goes through my mind when I come around the corner before the whoop sections on this track. I guess that's what I'm saying. Whereas back in the day on like a 17 RF supercross track, and just back in the day in general, a 14 supercross track, you would actually get a fear would come over you every single time you'd go around that corner before you hit that whoop section, because it was legit solid peaked enough whoops to where if you ever let that front wheel get off of them or out of whack, you're pretty much dead. So, I don't know. There was just they've lost an element of the actual real, what I consider the real whoop skill gap of the game. They've definitely lost that, and there's been some terrible 2020 RF tracks as far as the whoops have went this year, where there was just no skill gap to them at all. They were fucking rollers. They weren't even whoops. So at least, this isn't like super, super small roller whoops or whatever you want to call it, but it's also not what I consider like legit MX Simulator, AMA Supercross whoops either. So, but overall, solid track. Red Plate SX, red dirt vibe, clay dirt vibe. And this is also a really good example of how you can make, for instance, right here in this particular section, okay, this is a big part of, like, how this year, for whatever reason, RF has been so anti-quad anything. You can't quad this, even if they're doing it in the real life supercross race, we're still not going to let you hit any quads on any of the tracks. They've got this weird like quad restriction. We can't let anybody ever hit another quad on a supercross track. Boys, I don't know where they're getting that idea from, but what I did want to say is, like, right here, okay, you have a triple section, but the difference is you can design a triple section that is almost just as hard or skill gappy as a quad section. You just got to know how to build it, right? You got to have enough of a peak to the jumps and enough of a peak to the landings and enough distance and enough, like, open scaling to the section itself to create that skill gap. And this is one of the most perfect examples I've seen of that is, yeah, it's just a standard triple, but it's more difficult than most quads out there just because of, you really got to land this first triple properly, and then right here, he made this third jump of this second triple. Okay, let me just kind of explain this here. So you've got this triple right here, right? And then you got the second triple. And typically on if this would have been a 2020 RF Supercross track, they would have rolled the absolute shit off of this triple right here, the landing of the second triple, to where there was just no skill to it. But this right here, there's enough of a peak to it and enough of a skill in how tight this left-hand corner is right after this to where it creates a lot of skill gap trying to actually land that properly and not overshoot it and go off the corner and not undershoot it and come up short and pop off the bike. There's a ton of skill gap to that right there, even though it still is just a triple section, right? And then you got the skill of you're turning right away and then hitting this left-handed, over-under bridge section, and then you got another tight left right after that into a whoop section. There's a lot of skill gap to this whole, even though it's not some crazy complicated quad 5-7 jump or whatever. See how you can still make skill gappy sections even if you're not making some insane, huge rhythm? You see how you can do that? You still weren't really doing that in 2020 RF Supercross tracks, at least not for the first half. Yeah, there was one or two there towards the end of the series that, the scaling got a little bit better, everything like that. But particularly the first 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 rounds, they were terrible. There was just no skill gap. So that's my point. Even if you don't have huge rhythms, you can still make skill gap in ways, right? But I just wanted to kind of say that. But this is the kind of scaling you should have. This is the kind of scaling you should have had in every single one of those 2020 Supercross tracks. You should not have tried to revert back to that one-to-one scaling, small jump, small whoop, small corner, small everything. This is the way MX Simulator scaling is really supposed to be. This is it right here. I mean, this encompasses that perfect in-between one-to-one scaling and too big fantasy size stuff. This is basically that perfect in-between. And it doesn't really feel like it's got some super weird traction to it. I'm not going to say the traction's perfect, but damn, there was just some weird tractions they got this year in some of those Supercross tracks. It just made it feel super weird, way too friction-based. It's so bizarre on a Supercross track when you have way too high friction traction, so that's slowing you down, and then you got smaller rolled off berms, almost flat berms, so then that's slowing you down. So then the entire track is just slowing you down everywhere. And of course, a lot of the RF officials, their sort of mindset is, well, we gotta slow you down so that you don't quad into sections and shit. There's 1,000 other ways to do that other than just making the corners terrible and the traction terrible. There's literally another 1,000 ways to do that. And I think part of the problem is there are definitely the faster dynos in the game nowadays are starting to get almost too fast in this game. JLV needs to be really careful about that and not make bikes any actual faster, horsepower wise or from 0 to 40 miles an hour in the game. He definitely does not need to accelerate that process in more modern day dynos any more than it already is, or it's really going to jack up that whole not trying to hit a crazy 5 jump in, but still at the same time you got to have good enough corners so the track feels right. JLV is kind of playing with fire there a little bit when if he makes any more of these newer dynos any faster, or you're just going to have to make the scaling even bigger, and then there's no limit to it, right? You just got to keep making the scaling bigger, or you make higher friction traction, which sucks because then it just feels like you're on a slower dyno when you're really not. It's just the weird, and then it makes the tracks feel like they're deep sand tracks when they shouldn't feel like that, but they're trying to do that to try to make it to where you can't quad into a rhythm. You know what I mean? And then they're rolling off the corners to then try to make it again to where you can't quad into the rhythm. So you lose your corners, you lose the traction, the good traction, you lose everything. So, I would rather have a slower dyno than have a shittier track. But that's just me personally. So, either way, solid track. Off track's not like anything to hoorah about, but it's not terrible either. I mean, I say it's not terrible. It's pretty basic, but this is kind of typical for, most of these little supercross tracks like this in the game. I mean, they don't really usually do a whole lot off track. I mean, it's pretty typical as far as that goes, Just a skybox out here. Mountains are skybox. And then there's just some trees. So, yeah. It is kind of the typical. It's definitely not above and beyond. Have I seen worse off tracks? Yeah, believe it or not, I have. So, but, other than that, this is definitely gives you a cool vibe of like a real life training supercross compound or like a real life, KTM test track or whatever. Definitely gives you that kind of feeling. But my biggest point I want to make with this whole video, this is the kind of scaling that you need in RF 2021 Supercross racing. This is it. Do not ever go back to that bullshit like you had in 2020 Anaheim 1. Do not ever do that again. Don't ever do it again. Don't ever go back to those rolled off corners and those rolled off whoops and those little ass jump rhythms where there's no quads anywhere. He's got one quad right here where you can triple onto this table, which is kind of tricky in itself, and then you got to be able to jump off of that, and then you can actually hit this right here. This quad, I wouldn't say it's 1,000% perfect, but it's, it's a decent quad, right? To where it's not super, super hard. It can be a little weird just because of the nature of the way you land down in this jump, and then it's such an abrupt, quad first jump right here. Can be a little weird, kind of hard to hit, but, it's kind of one of those, 7 out of every 10, if you're really, really good at the game, kind of 7 out of every 10 laps you can hit it, right? It's kind of like that. So it would be a little tricky, especially if you had a road on the track. That would be one of those lines you probably wouldn't go for as much, which, a road just stacks on. Another issue with the road, it eliminates all your big lines once you get 3 laps into the race. That's another big issue with the road on the supercross tracks. Even if you build a perfect pre-made track and really cool rhythms and skill gappy areas, it's like a road just, whips around the corners like, oh, hey, fuck you. You're not going to hit any bigger lines because we're going to completely jank up the jump faces and jank up the corners to where it ain't even worth it in a pro race anyways on lap 4. So that's another just absolutely totally annoying thing about a road in the game that I completely hate when it comes to supercross tracks. But a lot of interesting kind of corner jump rhythms, multiple ways you can hit this stuff. The main triple, decent. I think it's kind of funny how the face of that almost looks like the same size of some of these, standard rhythm jumps right here. But, yeah, big enough berm, outside berm in the sand. It's cool. This track doesn't feel like it was, really made around a road. It's just a decent pre-made track to me. Could the berms have been slightly more, actually a little bit more of a peak on the actual berm itself? Yeah, it probably could have. But all in all, not a bad track. It looks real on the on track. The off track's a little bit lacking, but it is what it is. So overall, I'm going to give this puppy shit. I'm going to give this thing a 8 overall. That was pretty solid, dude. I mean, yeah, the off track kind of brings it down a little bit slightly, and then the whoops kind of bring it down another point because those definitely could have had a little bit more character to them. This is just the most standard way you could make those rolled off too easy whoops. It's the most standard. It's every whoop is the exact same size, which never really happens in real life. It's too perfectly built. These whoops right here are just there's no character to it. And yeah, you can say the overall track is kind of maybe missing a little bit of character because it really is kind of that perfectly built supercross track. If some way God in real life could just perfectly prep a supercross track, you know what I mean? Which never actually really happens, especially when you ride on it for more than a lap or two. There's going to be little characteristics The berm's going to have a little bit of a variation to it, like almost like there's a little bit of a pre-made little baby rut in it. Some of these jump faces are going to have a little bit of a change to the actual face. You know what I mean? So there's not really any character to it either, which it's all in how you want to look at it, how you want to look at track designs. But either way, not a terrible track. It is refreshing to get on here when somebody knows how the fuck to make scaling on a Supercross track. It's like, okay, thank God. Like, you know. But either way, I know it's been a minute since I've been making these MX Sim videos. I'm getting back into it, get back on that daily MX Sim grind. Getting that ball rolling again, dog. Getting back into the custom track making on that. My own self. We got a lot of stuff in store on that. Doing a lot of stuff on the custom track side behind the scenes right now. So, you know, be looking out for that. But yeah, man, I still love MX Simulator. It's still my favorite game ever. Don't ever think for a second just because I don't upload it for a minute that I'm like, stop playing it or like I'm on to other shit. I'll never be on to other shit. This is my forever game, dog. It's what I started on. I will forever play this game, dude. Even with all the bullshit or road and everything else they've done, I still play this game. I still love this game. I still love it, but I used to love it more, right? Almost doesn't even feel like the same game in a lot of ways, but I do still love it, and I still love going back on certain tracks that feel more like old school tracks and riding on them without a road. It definitely still has a fun feeling to it when you do things like that in the game. So, yeah, all we can hope for is change, and that's, you know, and it's funny because it's not even really change. It's just like go back to what was working before, to what was working just fine before. That's all I've ever really said. You know, it's like they've tried to fix something that wasn't broken. That's literally the definition of a road on MX Simulator. Trying to fix something that wasn't even broken. The game was fine before. It was not broken. It's just like pre-made will always be able to make a better rut than what a road can make, or a better kicker, or a better whatever. A road will always not really be able to replicate what you can make pre-made in the game. So that to me, you know, it kills a lot of the different characteristics you can put on a track pre-made wise, because it's like you got to build it with a road in the back of your mind, and then it changes the way you build pre-made tracks, and it's like you're making tracks that weren't even the same kind of tracks as the game had before. You know, it turns into a whole nother thing. But either way, appreciate you guys watching all the videos. I appreciate everybody still supporting me. I know it's been a crazy year already. I've been doing a lot of random different stuff trying to get everything going. So, but we will be in a routine. We will be clicking these videos off. Just had to give me a minute, bro. Appreciate you guys watching all the videos. Later, dudes.